After World War II, the world saw two global superpowers as the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. For the sake of time, we'll refer to them as the US and the USSR. The big difference between both of the countries were their political systems. The US is capitalist, in which almost everything is privately owned. The USSR, however, was communist, in which all classes shared their wealth. During World War II, the US and the USSR were best friends until the USSR spread their evil communist beliefs. The US saw this as a scheme to make the USSR more powerful than them. And you know how us Americans love our power. Then the US spread their capitalist beliefs, and tension grew, starting the Cold War. We'll be going over three main conflicts of the Cold War, which are the arms race for nuclear weapons of mass destruction, the space race, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the end of World War II, the U.S. made the Japanese threat surrender by dropping two nuclear bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At this point, no country on Earth except for the U.S. has such military power. The USSR quickly built their nuclear arsenal, and you can find many videos of nuclear bomb testings while each country tried to show their might. Europe made an alliance with the U.S., forming the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which displayed that the U.S. and its allies weren't afraid of the USSR. In retaliation, the USSR formed the Warsaw Pact with its allies, but things really heated up in Europe and the US as nuclear tensions grew. They started doing defense condition practices, which were drills if nuclear war did happen. Times were tense. The USSR was thinking of ways to display its power. Then a light bulb went off in their crazy Russian minds. They thought to launch a small satellite into orbit called the Sputnik. It was around the size of a beach ball and only took 98 minutes to orbit Earth's elliptical path. But it struck fear into the eyes of many Americans. The US thought that a spacecraft like the Sputnik could carry out nuclear attacks on the US. Quickly, the Soviets launched the Sputnik 2, but this time it was carrying a little puppy named Laika. Yeah, but too bad it died in orbit. The US quickly began development on the Explorer 1 satellite. The US then formed the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which was the nation's go-to for space explorations. In April 1961, the Soviets launched the first man into orbit. Then JFK and Congress gave NASA funding to put a man on the moon. Now both countries are trying to get a man on the moon, but Soviet scientists aren't cooperating, and they're going off on separate projects while workers at NASA work together. NASA went to launch their first Apollo rocket to space, but it failed miserably, killing 3 good astronauts. NASA eventually fixed these problems and went to send Apollo 11, carrying Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon. Then the USSR eventually gave up on space missions. The USSR did make a joint space station with the US, ending the space race. The Soviet Union spread its influence worldwide, even touching small islands that happened to be just south of their biggest enemies. Of course, I'm talking about Cuba. Cuban and American relations were great, but after the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro, Cuba and the USSR had growing relations. The US tried to invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs but failed. The USSR put secret nuclear missiles at Cuba to stop another attack, as America already had missiles facing the USSR in Italy and in Turkey. An American U-2 aircraft noticed the missiles over Cuba and told the president. The missiles had range to attack most of the mainland United States, and more importantly, the capital. President Kennedy was faced with many choices. Many wanted him to invade Cuba, but Kennedy instead made quarantine, because a blockade is technically an act of war. Then Kennedy moved to the U.S. to DEFCON 3. Then 2. The U.S. and Soviets were ready for an all-out invasion of Cuba. The Soviets said that they would remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. Fidel Castro still wanted to attack the U.S. first. On what is now known as Black Saturday, Khrushchev of the USSR made a public announcement telling Kennedy to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, as the US already planned to do. Cuba did shoot down a U-2 plane checking on the progress of the missiles, but nothing happened from there. Kennedy did want to make an agreement to disarm the Turkey missiles. Finally, the Soviets and the Americans came to an agreement to remove all of the missiles and leave Cuba alone. As you can see by these events, nuclear war was such a huge possibility at that time, with different people having different opinions and disobeying nations like Cuba. Now to finally see what stopped the Cold War. One of the things that marked its end was the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which lowered the numbers of nuclear arms in each country. Another kind of compromise was when the USSR finally broke up and mostly peaceful revolutions. And there you have it. This was the Cold War, explained by Troy Handley.